right. Well, I have so many questions. I had to bring reams of paper for this, but hopefully we're going to have a great discussion. I wanted to start off by, we're really pleased and thrilled that Acting Director Walden that you're here, and just a little bit about the Office of the National Cyber Director. It's been particularly top of mind for us at AWS and for our customers. And we hope we're aligned with the president's cybersecurity priorities and policies. And so, we have a saying at AWS: security is job one. It's everybody's job at AWS, and we think about it every day. It's the first priority for us, our customers, our partners, and all of our stakeholders. And we're really committed to that. It's something that we think about in almost every engagement that we have, and we're committed to building a really resilient future for our customers and partners globally. So, Acting Director Walden, we were teasing earlier, I want to call her Director Walden, but I have to call her Acting Director Walden. The ONCD is kind of the new kid on the block, so to speak, and you are the second director behind Chris Inglis at the White House. So maybe you can share a little bit about who you are and a little bit about ONCD.
Oh, I'm happy to. Well, first, thank you, Dave, for inviting me here to speak today. This is fantastic. Yes, I am the second and the acting director of the National Cyber Director's Office in the White House. We are the new kids on the block. But before I give you sort of the rundown about who we are, I just want to thank Mark there for talking about innovation, because cybersecurity for me and for our office is more than just national security. It's about tech innovation, and it's about economic opportunity as well. So hopefully, as we talk, you'll think in that broad term. But we were stood up in January of 2021 in the National Defense Authorization Act. We were authorized. In April, Chris Inglis was nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and he walked into the White House as employee number 1 in July. So almost exactly 2 years ago at this point. As the government does, we were not appropriated until November of 2021. And so he was able to then hire employee number 2 by then.
So he had built-in resiliency.
Built it in.
Yeah.
And so we've been sprinting a marathon ever since. We've been doing a number of things. And the last time we spoke, there's been a lot of work that's gone into the Office of the National Cyber Director. And so at the outset, we built an incredible team together. He started to hire. I was hire number 43. He came to me the day after Russia invaded Ukraine and said, "I'd like for you to be my second in command." And I was perfectly comfortable at another large tech company that we won't mention. And he inspired me to come to the office to execute the mission that we're here to execute. Our highest value asset are the incredible people, incredible men and women that we have in the Office of the National Cyber Director. So we went shoulder to shoulder building the office, collecting all of the good ideas, developing our strategic intent, which accumulates into 4 strategic outcomes that I'll weave in as we talk. But then we launched the National Cybersecurity Strategy in March, earlier this year. We collected all of the nation's priorities, presented them to the president. He signed and approved of the National Cybersecurity Strategy. And since then, we've been working on implementation of that strategy. We hope to execute our implementation plan soon. And along with that, we've been working on our workforce strategy that should be executed at some point soon. So we've been working hard and fast. There's a lot of work that's been going on in between, but those are the major milestones, the major movements of our orchestra, if that's okay.
Well, first of all, just thank you for that work and service. And we know, hiring and building, we do that at AWS quite a bit. We know that that's not easy work. And I can say I've met some of the folks in your office, and I would like to hire some of those people. They're really brilliant. I'm not putting a call out for that, there are some really talented people in the office, and it's really encouraging the work that you've done. So the folks in the audience today represent a cross-section of our customers, our partners. We've got representative customers and partners in healthcare and even some regulated industries. So that strategy you published in March, what role do you think that strategy plays for customers and organizations like that?
Oh, absolutely. So, I've been in the cybersecurity business for a while, and we've been doing the same things over and over again with some incremental improvements, for sure. But our National Cybersecurity Strategy has sort of two innovative pieces to it, from my perspective. The first is to sort of rethink how we're burdening cybersecurity risk, where that burden lives. And right now it lives on small businesses, communities, people, my daughter, my child's school, et cetera. So we're thinking about opportunities for lifting that risk and shifting it to those that are more capable. That includes AWS. But lifting that includes the federal government.
Sure.
Lifting that risk and moving it to those that are more capable of buying down that risk. And of course, you don't get to zero risk when you're thinking through cybersecurity. So we also have to think then in terms, and the second innovative piece of this is, what are the strategic investments that we're going to make in order to make sure that our cyber ecosystem is resilient? And not just in the technology, though we have a whole pillar focused in part on technology, but in people and in roles and responsibilities. What are those strategic investments? And the ultimate outcome that we're seeking to achieve, that we articulate in one form or another, is a digital ecosystem where individuals can thrive and prosper. That's it. That's what we're after. We're looking for a secure, resilient ecosystem that's aligned with our values. That is what we're trying to achieve, regardless of the adversary, regardless of the threat of the day, regardless of the technology of the day. That is the North Star. And so the strategy is built around 5 pillars with those 2 major shifts in mind, with the individual citizen as the customer at the end. And there are about 27 tools in that toolbox that we intend to draw on as we pursue that secure, resilient ecosystem. That's what the strategy sort of focuses on. I'm happy to get into all the bits and pieces that the policy wonks that are in this room would like for me to do.
Yeah, we'd love to do a session on all the tools.
Yeah.
So you've given us and others that challenge. Hopefully, we're rising to that challenge. But but in seriousness, we at AWS have spent a lot of time, and there's been a lot of, speaking of workforce, a very, very large workforce invested in building and scaling tools for security. And as I mentioned before, it's job one for us, particularly in the regulated sector, particularly in the federal sector, where we are hopefully delivering world-class capabilities for national security and defense and meeting their accreditation standards. Mm-hmm. So I've got to ask you, since we're at an AWS conference, how do you see tools that we build at AWS and services we build at AWS, how do you see those as having an impact in the mission in the federal government and with customers? How do you view those?
Sure. So I will talk about AWS cloud services, but I'll also talk about the federal government too, sure. So you know that we're actually trying to practice the things I'm about to preach. First, I'll say that the cloud is a key tool, from my perspective, in helping to shift that balance. You've already been doing that, right? Part of the premise of moving to the cloud, particularly for small and medium businesses, is to shift that burden of risk. But with that comes significant responsibility, because the last thing that we want to enable is a catastrophic consequence to a cybersecurity attack on cloud services, right? So on the one hand, we want to encourage the shifting of risk to those that are more capable of handling it, and I would include cloud service providers in that space. But on the other hand, we want to make sure that those cloud services are secure by design at the end of the day. And so there are some voluntary measures that have taken place that have gotten us to a point where we can say out loud that cloud services provide that sort of risk burden sharing. But we do need to go a step further. Cloud services are already pretty well regulated by sector. Each individual sector, the finance sector comes to mind, has a host of regulations that cloud service providers have to help their financial services sector customers meet. But there are other sectors that are less regulated or have different baseline cybersecurity requirements. At the end of the day, I think it serves the nation well if we raise cybersecurity baseline requirements through the 27 tools I mentioned, one of them is regulatory work, but also harmonize so that those that are taking on the biggest burden of cybersecurity risk are able to do so in an efficient, effective manner, right? So there are going to be some industries that need help raising baseline cybersecurity requirements, and that is going to require regulatory work, for example, or additional guidance using regulatory authorities from sector risk management agencies. But entities like the cloud, like cloud services providers, are going to have to leverage that across sectors because our digital ecosystem, frankly, doesn't stop at each sector, right? So there's a lot of work to do. I'm in it for the long haul. I'll say for the federal government, 14028, Executive Order 14028. This is, again, I'm sorry, policy wonk talking, but that it raised the cybersecurity requirements and the cybersecurity expectations for the federal government in real ways. And so my office, along with OMB, is focused on executing zero trust architecture, for example. So we are trying to raise our own baseline requirements across federal enterprises.
Right. Do you see all of those things? One of the big parts of the strategy calls for is building a more resilient future. Mm-hmm. So some of the things you just described, are those all elements of building a more resilient future for all of us, and are there other ones you would call out?
Yeah, so there are lots of tools in that toolbox. So the idea of building a resilient future, for those of you in the room, would include improvements to technology. But it's also improvements to people and how we react to cybersecurity attacks and how we challenge them. And it's also the roles and responsibilities, the C-suite, right? Who's responsible for what? Who's accountable for what? Who's guarding the gates? And are there any gaps there? And so when I talk about investing in our resilience, I'm talking about it not just in our technology, improving border gateway protocols, and moving to IPv6 in a responsible manner, looking at the backbone of the internet, the real technology pieces of it, securing our supply chain of chips and nanotechnology, right, semiconductors, hardware, including building secure software, right, and how do we build that in by design. All of those are technology pieces, but then there's the people piece, and that is really so key from my perspective in making sure that we have a resilient space, cyber ecosystem, that we're developing a workforce and education strategy just to touch on that piece of it. People are in cyberspace. We've created it, we use it, we can be vulnerable to it. And so we need to focus there, perhaps even more than the technology piece from my point of view. And then there's the roles and responsibilities, right? Who's accountable for what? A lot of what I do in my office is federal cohesion, assigning roles and responsibilities through that implementation plan that I mentioned early, to figure out what agency is responsible for what part of the strategy to make it work. Who are the consulting agencies, and then where does the private sector, where does academia, where does civil society plug in to really make this a national action plan? So we're focused on all pieces here. It's an all-encompassing activity that our office is really aggressively taking on.
Well, I knew you had a big job before, but when you just said federal cohesion, that kind of put the end cap on it for me. That is a big, lofty goal, but we're glad you're doing it. So I want to switch gears a little bit to something that I think is pretty much top of mind for everybody these days, and that's artificial intelligence, but particularly generative AI. And we heard from the Congressional AI Caucus this morning at the summit. We had a few members, and so I'm kind of curious to get your take. What are the cybersecurity considerations that you see around these newer technologies, around generative AI?
Well, thanks for that question.
Yeah.
It's almost like generative AI is on everyone's mind.
It's almost like that, yeah.
Look, we built our cybersecurity strategy, the National Cybersecurity Strategy, to be agnostic to emerging technologies or to threats, particularly. So that allows us to be nimble. And so that allows me to think about AI, generative AI in particular, because AI has been around for quite some time.
It has, yeah.
To try to figure out how we make sure that generative AI is used with our values in mind, and how do we cause it to be successful and innovative in a positive way? What are the cybersecurity elements to allow people to be able to leverage the power of generative AI safely? And so if you look to our cybersecurity strategy, and if you look at generative AI, there are 3 parts to it, and this is not a surprise to anyone in the room, right? There's data, there's the compute power, and then there's the intellectual property, the algorithm piece of it. If you think about the data piece of it, consider in our strategy, I think it's in pillar 4 and pillar 1, where we talk about making sure that we protect data in a responsible way, particularly as AI needs to consume data for its fuel. The strategy calls out, for example, quite earnestly for a national data privacy law. That is something that we can pursue and look forward to. We need to think about how do we analyze data while protecting it, right? What does post-quantum data analytics look like? Are we thinking through homomorphic encryption, for example, right? What are we thinking about when we think about protecting data as we use data analytics and cause it to be the fuel for AI? On that compute piece, Pillar 5 talks quite a bit about securing the supply chain of our semiconductors, right? Semiconductors and microchips. What do we think about nearshoring and onshoring the hardware, the firmware that goes into the compute power of AI? How do we think about securing cloud services, right? You're going to need hyperscale cloud in order to execute generative AI the way that you want it to. And so I know that we have several policies that are coming around on know your customer and cloud services, for example. Whatever you feel about that, that is an opportunity that, where we can think through how do we think about the compute power of AI. And then the algorithm piece of it, the intellectual property piece of it, from my perspective, is the people part of it, right? How are we recruiting and obtaining and training and retaining the talent that builds the algorithms for generative AI to be successful? What does that look like? How do we develop secure software in those algorithms, right? How do we think about that? How do we make sure that that is key, that we are taking software, instead of it being first to market, that it's secure to market? What are the market incentives that we're using to enable that? Those are all pieces that are addressed in the cybersecurity strategy, and that will be addressed in implementation. And that will be an evolving process to make sure that generative AI is both safe and successful.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of workforce and talent, I do want to say that I've really appreciated the leadership coming out of your office on workforce and talent. It's still a challenge, finding, developing, maintaining, retaining talent in this space is a big challenge for not just public sector entities, but for private sector organizations like ourselves. And I know the summit that you had this summer at the White House, I think, was really great. And we were fortunate to be able to participate. You're now coming out with a strategy around workforce. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, and maybe how we can support.
Absolutely. And first, thank you for supporting the White House Summit last summer. I really do appreciate it. I know AWS has been a good partner here. So we are coming out with our workforce strategy. We started thinking narrow terms. I'm a national security lawyer, so having 700,000 or whatever that number is, whatever statistic you're looking at, in vacancies in cybersecurity presented a lot of the national security anxiety in me, right? But when we started thinking about how are we going to deal with the immediate problem of filling those jobs, the question then became, over the course of those conversations over the summer and subsequently after that, was, well, what's the pipeline that we're building for those jobs? Because the truth is, we're filling the jobs, but the supply is outpacing the demand, right? Like it's almost that we don't have enough to fill those jobs at the speed that we need to fill them. So what does the pipeline look like? And how do we think about sort of human resilience against cyber attacks in the first place? So our strategy sort of thinks that through. So it's an ecosystem sort of approach. It's dealing with the immediate now. How do we fill the jobs now? But then what does it look like in 10 years? What's the pipeline in 10 years so that we don't find ourselves in this situation again, even if we solve for that national security problem now? So the strategy, I can say, which hopefully will come out in a couple of months, has 4 parts to it. It's the all proposition. How do we raise the digital resilience? How do we raise the digital literacy, the computational literacy of the general population? How do we upskill and reskill in that population so that they are able to not just use technology in a responsible way, but that they are able to access it, and that they're able to protect themselves in the way that we protect ourselves when we drive, by buckling our seatbelts, right? We don't need to know how to create a car, but we know how to buckle our seatbelts. So what are we doing there? How are we executing that? And so we have a whole host of actions in our workforce strategy to address the all population. But then what's the pipeline look like? What are we doing in our educational system, in our K through 12, in our vocational skilling training? How are we thinking about that? How are we integrating curricula so that in addition to reading and writing, we have computational math in a way that my 7-year-old is going to be able to deal with and manipulate generative AI in 10 years, right? Like, what are the skills that we're building into our curriculum in schools and in vocational training facilities to be able to meet the moment? Secondary education, tertiary education, PhDs, right? As we onshore semiconductor fabs, for example, what are the requirements and skill sets we need for that? And how are we building that into our educational system? But then there's the core, the national cyber workforce issue, which is your issue, and you share that with the federal cybersecurity employment issue. And so we have 2 pillars dedicated to the immediate now, the national cybersecurity and the federal security. And in this audience, one of the things that I will say that I've been challenging myself and my staff to think through is, what are the artificial barriers that we're putting in place to that pipeline for filling those jobs right now? Is it really, what are the skills that we need? So what I would love to hear, and what I'm hearing from the workforce, the federal workforce, from a different perspective, what I would love to hear from the private sector is, what truly are the skills that are needed in today's cybersecurity workforce? And do we really need to focus solely on people who code? And I've got people in my staff who do code, and that's great. I am not one of them. But do we also need people that think differently, that that have different business skills, that have different legal skills, that can contribute to the full cybersecurity workforce, right? Do we need people with CISSPs or CISMs or whatever the other sort of CEHs, or do we need a particular type of skill that we're not really training for, or that we have a blind spot to? That's what I would love to hear about, so that we can action some of the work. I've talked to companies that have engaged very directly with nonprofits, with school systems, with academia, to be able to deliver that kind of connection. If we need to be able to scale that.
Great, that's great feedback. I think we should get your staff to get you a T-shirt that says "Lawyers can code too," type of thing. But, so your office, we've been talking about terrestrial things, but your office has been focused on cybersecurity now, to bolster cybersecurity in space. And it occurs to me that at Amazon, we have a few interests also around space. And you hosted a summit at the White House, which again, we went to. So we're interested in almost everything that you all are doing. So what are the next steps you see there as it relates to those efforts, and what do you see as some of the best practices?
Okay, yes, so thank you again for supporting that executive forum. Let me just take a step back and give you the perspective that we come to space with, and then I'll give you the look forward. If you look back, one of the lessons that we learned, like I said, Chris approached me the day after Russia invaded Ukraine, so I've been thinking about this for a little while, and I've been meeting with Ukraine quite a bit. One of the lessons that I learned was that intelligence is key in order to evolving your cybersecurity system, your cybersecurity framework. The US government gave a set of intelligence to Ukraine in order to be able to motivate to work the Russian aggression against Ukraine. So intelligence sharing has become a different thing. Information sharing has become a different thing. It's become operational. And so what you experienced in the executive forum was that operational sort of pivot, right? Where we shared bespoke intelligence to the entire representation of the space market, so from the venture capitalists to those that own constellations, to help the entire ecosystem understand that it's connected, not just an ecosystem in delivering communications, but how it's connected as an adversary might think about it. And so that sparked policy conversations then that were open. One of the things, in addition to how we shared intelligence on the onset of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, was that the adversary took a blow at Viasat in the early stages of the war, which had cascading effects in Germany, for example. This is something that we can tackle, and that we can, working together, can think through. So with that in mind, we had the executive forum, and the last administration produced what we know as Space Policy Directive 5, which is basically how the cybersecurity framework for space systems. We have a National Space Council that was developed that the Vice President chairs. So with all of these tools that we have and the new information that we have, how do we come together to build a cyber secure space ecosystem? So we had the launch, we had the conversation with NASA and Commerce and all of the, you can imagine, I think it's all on our website, all the departments and agencies that are involved, the entire market and space came together and had policy conversations. And one of the outcomes was that we needed to baseline where we are in cybersecurity across the entire ecosystem. And so my office, alongside the Space Council, and with support from the National Security Council, has been doing some baselining work in regions. So I was in Long Beach, I don't know now, maybe a month ago, maybe a few weeks ago now. My staff's saying, yes, that's where you were. Out in California, talking to space industry there. There's Space Beach in Long Beach, right. which was fascinating, understanding what the baseline looks like and where it needs to go. We're hosting something similar here in the DC area to talk through what that baseline looks like. And we'll be doing these workshops throughout the country, in Houston and Florida and et cetera, really to get a great understanding of what it looks like. And that way we can frame then the next steps for securing space, the whole space ecosystem.
Yep, that's great. So last big question. There are differing approaches to improving cybersecurity, and there are a lot of mechanisms out there, from voluntary mechanisms to regulation. And our perspective is the collaboration between government and private sector is going pretty good. Mm-hmm. Do you have examples maybe that you could share of where that collaboration works? Are there thoughts that you have on how to make that even better as we work with your office and others across the government?
Yeah, I have a lot of examples of how it works, and of course, there's always space for improvement. Sure. I wouldn't be in the position that I'm in if I thought we were done. So one great example is just the creation of our National Cyber Strategy to begin with, right? It is truly a national cybersecurity strategy. We, the Office of National Cyber Director, just happened to hold the pen. But we had AWS and other companies similarly situated. We had small and medium businesses. We had academia, civil society all weigh in. That is true collaboration in building a national strategy where everybody has a role for doing those two things, shifting the risk and investing in resilience. So that's one good example. We're continuing that ethos in building our implementation plan, where it's a national process for taking action on strategy. Our executive forums, where we are more forthcoming with tailored intelligence across certain sectors as they become sort of apparent to us, to have the policy conversation so that we're not continuing to make policy in a vacuum, right? That's just our office. But then you look at places like CISA and the JCDC, where there could be, I admit, some improvements there, but it's an amazing opportunity that Jen Easterly has seized in developing true operational collaboration so that private sector and the government discover problems together and come up with solutions together. Sure, there can be improvement there, but then NSA has the CCC, the Cyber Collaboration Center, I think it is, the CCC, where they are developing operational partnerships with the defense industrial base. It's a little bit of a different model, but it's a model that could use some improvement, sure. But it's a model where it is both those that own our infrastructure and those that have certain authorities to protect it get together to solve problems together. So there are lots of examples. We're always looking for more examples. I collaborate quite a bit with my counterparts in other countries because we know that our digital ecosystem doesn't enjoy actual geographic borders in most instances, right? So it's all of it, and it's I don't know if you know this, but I used to play the piano, and I love music. So that's a thing. So I love music, and sort of instruments sort of playing and doing their own thing. It sounds like noise, but when it's orchestrated appropriately, it's beautiful. And that's what we're trying to achieve with this collaboration. It has to be a collaborative opportunity, otherwise you just have strings. Yeah. And that's lovely, but that's not an orchestra.
That's not music
what I mean?
either.
It's not music.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Acting Director Walden, thank you very much. This conversation has been great. We appreciate your time. We appreciate that the building that's going on in your organization and the resiliency that was already built in. And I think we fully support the work that you're doing, and we want to make sure the partnership extends well beyond the future and hopefully be a small piece in that orchestra. I think also I'll say I have 2 7-year-olds, so let's get those 7-year-olds in the pipeline early.
Yes, absolutely.
Let's get them activated in that pipeline early. But we really appreciate this conversation today. Thank you for taking the time with your schedule to come and visit with us. It's been a really great discussion. So thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. All right.